talking separate from SOV access. Just talking about, whatever they're doing here on the island. So all that to be said is it was an interesting journey. There were some tough moments. I enjoyed actually working with all of you on it. I got to get to know Judy, who I didn't know before here. I learned a lot about Mercer Island, that you don't just beat my little league team during the summer with your 16-year-olds posing as 11-year-olds. Oh, come on. But anyway, yeah, well, then there's football, right? Yeah, our football team, right? They're all from Bellevue, I'm sure. Anyway, I just want to say thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful end of the year, and we'll pick back up with Julie and go from there.
Thank you again.
On to item 2.
Thanks, Tony.
Enjoy your dinner. All right, item 2 was fully funded education. We've, of course, talked about that at some length, but the question now becomes, year ahead, what should we be asking for? What should we be anticipating might be a likely outcome in Oregon?
So in terms of education funding, I think that obviously coordinating, as you do very well with the school district, figuring out what it is that they really need, first and foremost, I think, of course, recognizing that there's just locally the things that we need, including supporting the school levy, which is a fundamental piece of the assumption that schools will be whole and will be continuing to have their levies funded, and that's obviously going to be a critical part locally. And then also just recognizing, again, the needs, whether it's around special education that hasn't been fully funded, and recognizing that that's still a need. And again, issues that the school counselors and things like that are still not something that the state is paying for. And so continuing the great support the city has given on that, I think, will be critical. I think probably the most thing that we'll see are tweaks around the edges of the actual McCleary plan, again, around like special ed and things like that. But what you might see is kind of a connection with number 4, which is figuring out, are we going to continue to rely on the property tax as the funding mechanism, or can we figure out a way to offset the property tax increases with some other funding stream? And that will be, I think, a big discussion item that we will be looking at, of how we can potentially lessen the blow on the property tax front and have it rely on some other funding streams, so that it's not quite the hit to our communities on that.
Oh. Well, I was just going to comment. To the best of my understanding, the school district has provided us with their priorities, which are those of WSSDA, and I'm glad to see it. I know at least Ralph is here, which is great. Last year, I think we took a lead from the school board and what they wanted to prioritize. We have it this year. It would be super helpful, I think, for us then equally to understand from our school district whether or not there's certain points within these priorities. I know, that there's been discussion about the levy issue, the fully funding special education, and then I think there's some other ones in there. But the extent to which we could prioritize within this, I'm sure, could probably help you and then help us narrow our efforts as well.
And we had a wonderful meeting with the school board a couple weeks ago, too, so they laid out some of those priorities. And one of the, again, with the property tax adjustment, I think that also applies to not only around education, but that kind of funding mechanisms for local communities, again, whether it's raising the 1% cap, which also has been hurting local communities. And the irony is that it was not something that we could get passed in the Senate to increase the 1% cap for cities and counties, and yet in order to fund education, we lifted that cap on the state property tax component. They also had the limit of 1%, and we managed to lift that on ourselves, but not for local communities. So again, adjusting that and then connecting to the schools. There are some other mechanisms, like it takes 60% to pass a school bond, but school levy is 50%. School bond at 60% is about the only thing that has to have 60%. So is there, for a lot of communities, they've been trying for years and years and years to pass school bonds at about 58% or 59%. And so maybe changing that back down to the 50% as it used to be. for school bonds, and that would help other communities. Probably not real huge focus for this community, but for other school communities, I think that will be a big change as well.
I could. I know you supported AWC often, especially state shared revenues. We really count on that as a city because we don't have a lot of revenue sources. So whenever the state tries to, claw back those revenues, it really is alarming for us. So that'll be something for us. I know we'll, through AWC, track. The other thing that Chip Porter mentioned today with us was, and we'll put this together, but on REIT 2, there are a number of restrictions on REIT 2, restrictions of not being able to fund public buildings. It would be great to actually loosen those restrictions. On REIT 1, having some flexibility there as well. In fact, on REIT 1 and 2, there's a restriction that it can't fund, for example, equipment, technology, and as you know, in a lot of buildings today, you are funding those things as part of the facility. So those types of restrictions would, and again, I'm just thinking one-time assets and expenditures, but not necessarily ongoing. But it would be nice to be able to have some flexibility with REIT, because not only are we suffering on the operation side, but the capital side has a need. We've deferred maintenance on a number of things, and so it would be nice to be able to use those REIT dollars for public buildings, because that's usually in the recession, that's where you tend to get the hit on deferring those maintenance things. That was another funding issue that would be super helpful.
So I should say some glowing words about Tana's leadership in the local government caucus. Our caucus has lots of little sub-caucuses. And the people, you'd be surprised how many people come from local government in the House, and so they have banded together. So it's very helpful to have what you want, because we have a group of people who will stand up. That's how we got the public records, because that had been languishing all those years of all these costs that go in. And it took 2 local government people on each side of the aisle to get it through. It's pretty good. So we will continue to work on those things. I have to say that I've been so distressed over having to put all of our eggs in the property tax basket, because it impacts all the local cities and and they're coming in and they're asking for help with transportation, and there aren't that many things that we can give them so that they can do their roads. They're dying under growth. The suburbs have grown by 30%. The growth in the suburbs of our main metro counties, which is Pierce and King and Snohomish. So everything like from 405 out has grown by 30%. That's why we have the congestion that we have. But they're coming in on these little two-lane roads. Well, there's nothing left to give them, because you can't go to the license tab, which is their usual. You can't go to the property tax. The sales tax is capped. And so if people are sitting, without having some of these things happen, it's because they have no options. There is no other new glowing way to help cities fund their services. And I think we did a great disservice by taking all the taxing capacity out of the property tax. And when we talk about looking at other taxes, they're not going to be any more fun. Nobody's going to like them. But we have never taken a major funding source and used it all up. We've always done a few different kinds of taxes to make up billions of dollars over the years that I've been in. I've been in there 16 years, and we were able to cobble together taxes to get to every time we needed to go forward. To have it all on one thing is going to be very stressful, I think, for people.
Can I just ask you guys which new tax you think might pass this legislative session? Is it the capital gains? Is it income?
Oh, there's no income tax. That's something that people pull out. There'll never be an income tax in the state.
So where do you see the new tax?
Well, there were a couple of taxes. Capital gains should be on the table because it's something you can bring up and you can modify, and you don't hit little people who are retired in their homes and don't have an income. It's people who have income, only high-end income, and you don't take retirement, you can craft it, and you can hit just enough people that they're able to pay for it, and many of them would like that better than the property tax, I think, if you're trying to make it more even. But
Even the majorities, do you see that happening this year?
it's not much of a majority.
Well,
Either side.
I think
it's hard.
I think it would be hard. I think anything that would be proposed would probably end up on the ballot in November, and purposefully so. So I think whether it's, whether it's reduce the property tax with a capital gains tax or reduce the property tax with a carbon tax, I think would end up again on the ballot in November for voters to weigh in on. I think there could be some other adjustments. I know one proposal that we had been working on in the House to adjust the B&O tax to really give a huge exemption for smaller businesses who get hit with the B&O tax, gross receipts, and so really raise the threshold before small businesses would have to pay any B&O tax, and then adjust and make it a little bit more equitable on the higher end for the larger companies or for the larger income receipts companies. So there are other kind of mechanisms that we've been looking at that wouldn't necessarily go to the voters, but I think one of those big components like a carbon tax or a capital gains tax, I think would go to the voters. So we would present something to go to the voters, but not necessarily implement something.
Can I ask a question on this adjusting the 1%? I mean, this has been on the legislative agenda for years, and I'm just looking at the recap by Kirsten, and it didn't get considered by the House, and I'm just curious, what can be done to push this legislation further along? And I guess the Democrats control the House, so why didn't it even get considered? I guess
There are a number of issues on, first of all, the 1% and the beauty of the AWC and the SCA is that it's very bipartisan. And you had Republicans pushing for lifting the cap as hard as you had Democrats pushing for the cap. There are a variety of issues that it wasn't really worth bringing up for a vote in the House because we knew it was going nowhere in the Senate. So whether it was, a gun responsibility issue or an environmental issue or a whole variety of issues, when you knew you weren't going to get anywhere in the Senate, it just kind of wasn't worth the time. So we talked about it a lot, we discussed it a lot, we worked on it a lot, but it didn't come up for a vote. So that's what I would say on why it didn't come up there. I do think there's renewed or a new opportunity. I do think that will be something that we revisit. I think there's a lot of recognition. I mean, it's cities and counties from all over the state that are coming in clamoring, please help us. One of the big issues is around civil legal aid and things that, the state requires counties to pick up civil legal aid, but we don't fund that at all. And so as that grows or as their budgets, shrink or, the 1% kind of keeps that down, they really don't have any resources that they can use for that. So, there are lots of pressure points that are coming into play. I would encourage you to continue to be part of that and to push for that as a priority. On all of this, I think you will hear everybody saying it is a 60-day session, and so we will be working to get a lot done. We're trying to keep our own expectations of what, now that the Democrats control the Senate and the House and the governor's office, we're trying to control our expectations of what we think we can get done, as well as the community and the statewide expectations of what we can get done in this short session. But that's certainly something on my agenda.
I would just like to clarify something, because I kind of talked about Republicans like, this was a bad thing. I just want to say that the Senate Republicans were very different this year, because we work with our Republicans all the time. House passed the capital budget with one no vote. It was, you know, we were working together, we work on transportation stuff all the time, and there was just a tenor over the last couple years that just created a new way of doing business, which we're seeing in other parts of the world, but I think it might change that dynamic, that there are Republicans who will come and work together, and we can craft something that both sides like, and that's the opportunity that I'm looking for. And that will be different, and that doesn't mean we run out and do everything that one side wants. You just don't do that. So I see it as an opportunity to have people who really work together to get good policies that we can all agree on, and that's not going to be anything that's way over to one side or the other.
Tom?
Yeah, I'm just doing math in my head, and number 1 blended into number 2, and number 2 is blended into number 4. And I was, just from your purview as state, local, district representatives, do we know that if there are any other locales that are going to voters to ask to increase property taxes? Because we're in a position now that it's being messaged that we're looking at 2 property tax increases, one for a capital levy and one for an operational expense levy. And I think that's kind of unique to Mercer Island, but I also hear, I respect what you're saying, that you're hearing that a lot of cities are asking to remove the 1% cap. But I don't know that I've seen any momentum for like voters to approve that. And then the other part on my statement more than a question is when I look at the sound transit taxes that you said that are coming, I think you used I wrote it down because it's kind of the way I feel. What's that?
Primal screen.
Primal screen. I thought that was a great way to phrase it, and that people are going to go berserk. So you have the sound transit taxes, the McCleary decision funding. You want to, we're messaging now that you want to push through the 1% cap to a higher limit. And then I'm balancing that with my former role on the PTA when they're going to be asking for money next year. And all this is going to be coming out of the property taxes. So what happens to our constituency? Because we have a lot of families locally here on the island whose property values, they keep using $1 million projections in our city budget. But the reality is the average is 1.4 million now. And you have dual working parents. I mean, when does somebody pull the hand on and say, you know, enough is enough on our property tax increases?
What's happening in this club? You know, they were going out for their school district, and the legislators who had voted on the property tax went out and said, I'm not to support the school district hitting the property taxes. I think that's what we're going to see, that we have used up that property tax capacity, and I wouldn't look at anything until we know how people feel after they get their property taxes. It's a sleeper. I am, you know, talking to people and they have no clue, even though it was in the news. And it is not going to be small. And if we can even change it, it will be only a small amount because we are under court order for all these years to fully fund education, which I support.
So again, exactly to your point of, we don't think the education from the state should have been relying on the property tax for that very reason. I mean, we're just going back and back and back and back to voters on the property tax. And there's the voter fatigue around digging people on the property tax, indeed. And, you know, there is the loan for, or property tax forgiveness if you're significantly low income and some of that, but, you know, in this arena, I mean, you have to be seriously low income to apply, for that to apply.
Oh,
so.
that is though something that is being looked at. There is someone who's, AARP is working on getting an income-based rise in people who can be taken off the property tax. So, you know, for people who really have the lower income, I think it's at 40 now, and they were thinking of going up to 60. And if you're below that, then you might get an exemption. So there are a few things we can tweak around the edges, but basically you can't do anything if that's how you're funding education. You can't take it away unless you replace it with something else.
Others on this?
And I do just want to say, while that I think that our community still does support, you know, education, and our school levies, and some of these levies are replacement levies and not necessarily things that will increase it in addition. So I don't want anyone listening to think that it's just going to be continuing to increase. It's, a lot of it is a maintenance of property taxes that people are currently paying.
So seeing no further questions on that, we're going to go from big to very small in scope. Item 3 was allocation of recreation/transportation funding for Aubrey Davis Park Master Plan, which, as you know, is something we're looking, on multiple levels, we're looking for WashDOT support on that. It was both in terms of having their staff come to the table, but it was also in terms of funding, and we didn't make much progress on that. It remains certainly a high priority for the city.
And it's still out there, because we didn't pass that budget, so we can continue to work on it.
So there will be a 2017 budget eventually passed, and then there'll be a 2018 supplemental capital budget. So it would still be, it would be something, I don't think they're gonna go back and reopen 2017, but 2018 would be a supplemental, yes.
I think there was another point in this, and that is, in the event that the capital budget doesn't get passed or Mercer Island doesn't get funding, the extent to which we can secure technical services.
Yeah, technical services was,
At no
I
cost.
thought that was good, yeah. That's a good
Because
answer.
it seems it
I like
washed
that.
out, it seems to pepper conversations with, well, you could reimburse us on some hourly basis, which
Yep.
doesn't
I like
feel
that.
particularly good in that case. But I think also we'd be interested in starting to understand what it would take to set ourselves up well to implement portions of the master plan. Because that would clearly be a multi-year initiative on our part. So the extent to which I can, or some of us can work with you to understand what groundwork we need to lay to make that an easier funding ask come the time the master plan's done, that would be much appreciated.
Maybe Julie would build on this, but we were asking about this, of course, a year ago, which is why it's on our agenda from last year. Progress has been made, and WashDOT's very much been, I think, part of a conversation now about how do we advance this master plan. And they, I think, have not backed away from the concept of billing. It's just to attend those meetings, but they still, yeah, which is,
That's a good thing.
that's
You think
progress.
that's a win.
But the question of the technical services and, of course, the deeper funding for it remains on the table. Item 4 was adjust the property tax cap. Anybody want to add more on that? 'Cause we obviously blended it together with item
And maybe that needs,
2.
Mayor, maybe that needs to be more kind of like, just provide more ability to fund our services, more different, and just, so as you're saying, not completely reliant on property tax, maybe there can be some other,
Local government funding options.
some other local government funding options, that's right.
I guess that's why I was asking the question is, it was a 2017 priority. I think some of this is moving into 2018. And I
Yes.
just wonder if that is phrased in a way that, I just worry that it does us a disservice if we aren't looking at different options.
So I think that's fair to maybe, when we come back for the draft, to tweak that, okay.
So that just extend what revenue options, and then the property tax becomes a subset of that.
Okay. Item 5 was enhanced health and human services. We want to speak to where we got and where we're going.
So in 2018, I have no doubt that addressing the opioid epidemic will be a huge component of the work that is to come, whether it's restricting prescriptions around opioids, drug take-back is definitely on the table to get some of those extra drugs out of people's homes so that youth and adults don't have access to them as much, readily access to them. So there'll definitely be a continued work on the opioid. It's a issue. It's a huge epidemic across the entire state. It's affecting companies not being able to find workers who pass drug tests. It's obviously health costs. It's just across the board. So that is really a huge issue that will definitely be addressed. We'll keep working on tobacco to 21 for sure. I would say that one of the major issues with that is that it's a sales tax revenue hit to the state. And so not to be too cynical, but right, when people buy cigarettes, it's a huge revenue stream to the state. One of the reasons is to help reduce, you have a high sales tax to help reduce people buying those. But it's still, when we are looking at being strapped for revenue, that has been, frankly, one of the issues on
But
that.
hasn't marijuana revenue been robust?
Marijuana revenue is very robust, but marijuana revenue has been baked into the budget, and we're already counting that money.
It's already counted
It's
for.
already counted for. It's
We have to be
amazing.
smoking continuously.
Yeah.
It's what we
It's-
have.
And in fact, one of the local government options is to share more local
Yeah.
marijuana and liquor revenue.
We support that.
So sharing that revenue has been a big goal of local governments, and that, again, has been something the state has been loath to do because it takes the revenue out of the state coffers. So it is definitely a huge issue. I think other things coming up, so the document reporting fee, as the mayor mentioned at the beginning, they did extend this past year, but I think we're looking to increase that slightly, to maybe make that permanent, and that really goes towards affordable housing and homeless services, which have been critical. I want to applaud the city for maintaining its support of ARCH and the affordable housing crisis. We talk about the cost of property taxes, but I think there was a recent article that said you had to make $76,000 for a family of 4 to be able to afford to live in Seattle. And on the east side, it's $94,000. So if you're making less than $94,000, a family of 4, you can't afford to live, and that's not even having a coffee a day, that's not owning a car, that's using public transportation. So this is a huge issue, and that spills over, as we obviously see in the homeless population, and everywhere. And so that's really a critical issue for our communities. And the fastest growing homeless population is in the suburbs. Families on the streets. The amount of homeless youth in our schools is well over 20,000 homeless kids, K through 12. I think it's nearing 30,000. So this is a huge issue. So affordable housing and those housing services is going to be a big issue.
Can I ask a question regarding the affordable housing and trying to find dedicated funding? I suspect that there's probably constitutional legal issues or concerns, but what about what Vancouver and Toronto and other cities have done as far as imposing a tax on foreign buyers? I mean, I know that this has been kind of the issue that's sort of talked around right now because we have a lot of foreigners buying homes. A lot of these homes are empty, they're done for investment purposes. I'm just curious whether or not that's something that is even considered or being considered down in Olympia as a possible source. And again, really dedicated for perhaps for affordable housing.
So I think the question has been looked at. Our state constitution is a little bit different than BC, and so there were some constitutional issues for Washington State. I think also in the climate of kind of anti-immigrant sentiment around the country, people were loath to really kind of target foreigners, if you will, in any specific way in particular, just again, given the climate. So I think the combination of the two didn't make it a realistic approach. Again, I think, I can't remember, we did look into it, and there was some constitutional issue on that. Just continue a little bit off on the health and human services component too. Keep in mind, as Tony was mentioning, on the federal level, a little bit of lack of success, if you will, or movement on the national level. There are some things that haven't been reauthorized, in particular children's health plan, CHIP, S-CHIP. And if the feds don't renew that, that's going to be a huge budget item coming up for the state in 2018, upwards of $240 million to just continue providing health care for the kids that currently are on the health care plan. And there's a variety of other things that haven't been renewed around home visiting and some other federal dollars that are huge funders for our state that will, just from off the bat in 2018, put us in the hole just as we start out if those federal dollars aren't renewed. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
And since I am on healthcare, I do get to see and hear from the insurance commissioner who's working really hard to make sure that we have service providers all across the state. Even, we're in better position, we actually have better healthcare than most states. It worked well here, we got on top of it, people signed up, you know, it was really very robust. The fact that it is sort of peeling, you know, they're trying to implode it, so as it goes away, that, I think we can make it through 18, but after that, if all the things come through, I don't know that there will be health care. And I think we really, when we look at the homeless issue, I think it's, one of them is there's so many different kinds of homeless. A lot of the homeless that we're really worried about that are sitting all over the streets are linked to opioids and that kind of issue. And so if you have to have those together. You have to have the treatment and you have to have the place to go. And then you have to have the places for people who are just starting out can go, but they're not necessarily going to end up on the street, but they're going to end up couch surfing or, you know, at home with their parents forever. Or, you know, there's all these other, it's so many different levels. And we so often we're concentrated on the opioids because that is actually the root cause. And then there's a place for them to go to get the next step up. So when you're looking at health and human services, you have to look at it from the very bottom to the top. And I think we put a lot of money in our state into housing, affordable housing in particular. It is the Speaker of the House, it's his, you know, passion. And we have it over transit stations, we have them integrated into every piece of surplus property that comes up. We have lots of effort that goes into housing people. But if we don't get the health and human services part of it, it won't matter how many we have, because they'll still be out there if they can't function. So it's kind of a chicken and egg.
I just had one question before you leave, number 5, and if I'm out of bounds here, I wasn't really briefed on what questions to ask or how to ask. But on the enhanced health and human services component, I understand the opioid epidemic, but I spend a lot of time in hospitals, unfortunately. And some feedback that I got from some of the staff there is that when they crack down on the prescription forms for opioids, and I'm not a drug expert, so forgive me if I misstate a drug, but there have been some unintended consequences that they've now moved people into heroin. Is that an opioid too? But they're seeing an uptick in heroin and some other drugs on the east side, and I'm just wondering, again, similar to the property taxes, why we are only focusing on opioids in this and not the bigger drug epidemic.
So I will tell you that opioids include heroin. It is
Okay.
that it is just that it's a street drug.
Okay.
And they get addicted. So you go in, you have your tooth pulled, and the dentist will give you 30 pills. You don't need more than 2. So now you got all those leftover pills, somebody gets in there, they get on them, and then they can't afford them. So there's the choice, the drug of choice is heroin. So most of the people that you talk to on the streets are on heroin because they can't afford anything else. But it starts with this overabundance that was sold, because I was in the market, I mean, I was a nurse and I was in the legislature, and the doctors and the pharmacists would come in and say, these are such great drugs, they're not, you don't get addicted, they're non-addicted. And people were given so much pervasively, and this is across the United States, this is not a Washington State issue. And people got on them, and it spread like wildfire, and we're still, one of the bills that we couldn't get passed last year, but we'll probably get passed this year, was actually, there's a group of doctors who will police themselves, and they will police other people, because you have to go in now and register if you're going to do opioids. But trying to get more support for that kind of thing where doctors can't
Okay,
give
so
that many
this is
pills.
broader than, and
Yeah, it is.
people have moved from pills to needles
Yeah,
maybe, but it's
that's how-
broader than just the prescription.
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'm good with it.
And just for people who might be listening, actually dentists prescribe the most opioids, even more than doctors. So if you go into the dentist, just be aware that you might be being sent home with a very large prescription that you probably don't need, again, for a 30-day supply, but maybe only for a couple days, and you want to make sure you don't have those around the house, you're not tempted yourself, or have your kids or others get access to those.
We've completed 5 items. We have, we go through item 9. We're 90 minutes in. The question is, would you like a break or would you like to power through? Power through comes from the answer from both of our guests. So let's do that. Yeah, Dan had another commitment this evening that he mentioned. Okay, so item 6, preserve the environment, and a bunch of good things happened over the last year, last session. Obviously, the sort of big one is the price on carbon, and you've mentioned that a little bit, but I'm certainly curious to hear further thoughts on whether it looks like there's an avenue that gets us to that, and more on these other items as well.
I'll take that one. I'll mention that one. So, first of all, I just want to start out by saying Mercer Island has really been such an amazing leader going 100% green power. I applaud you guys for that. So that's really, I think, just you guys are living your agenda right here, so thank you. Thank you for that. And I know, Mayor, you've been a huge proponent of the environment and those kind of things, so thank you. I think that there's lots of discussion about doing, again, a carbon tax to offset property tax as a potential option. Especially when we have a decline in the amount of revenue that comes in from the gas tax. But, there are obviously a variety of issues around that. Is a carbon tax going to then ultimately trickle down to consumers around the gas tax increase? But I think even more so, because it's a 60-day session and a carbon tax is extremely complicated, there isn't an existing proposal that is kind of cooked and ready to go per se that we have all been briefed on significantly, and so it might be a harder sell in a 60-day session. Having said that, I think there's lots of enthusiasm for it in all three caucuses. And so it's definitely, I think, a huge potential and is on the table and something that I think people really want to do. I know the business community really wants to see it as, if we have a carbon tax, as a way to offset carbon and to help fight climate change, which I think we would all also support, but would be a harder, but I think there's also interest in having an offset property tax. So it's kind of a little bit of a dance there, definitely wanting to make it affect climate change, and yet also offset property tax. So I think there's a little bit of a dance there, but what it means. I do think, we have, as people will say, a blue wall on the West Coast, and maybe that can be a green wall, and lots of work between BC, Washington, Oregon, and California to have something that really works. So I definitely, again, think there's lots of interest on that. One thing that Kirsten mentioned around the energy code, I would say one of my odd hats potentially was serving on State Building Code Council, where a lot of the energy codes the energy codes are written and created, and we do have as a state a goal to reduce carbon by I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but going back to an earlier output of carbon, thank you, 1990, carbon output, and we have to get there by 2030, I think. And so we have to hit certain goals, and we do that a lot through the built environment. So the energy code goes through the State Building Code Council. One of my big priorities, and I would love if it was on your agenda as well, is to actually fully fund the State Building Code Council. It's also one of those things that permit fees have not been increased since 1989. And we're talking, they're at $4.50 for a residential permit. This is what the builder pays, and literally has not gone up since 1989. So we're talking about bringing it to $10. So these are small dollar items, but it would help make sure the State Building Code Council is functional, and that is definitely key. And played, frankly, a big role in making sure that marijuana grow houses and marijuana processing plants and things like that could come into existence, because we have to do new codes around that. So it does play into the revenue for the state as well.
So I would just talk from the transportation side, because we are the bigger impacts. The VW settlement has come down across the United States. They are going to be sending money to the states, and so it's been really interesting because most of it goes into transportation, but it was put into the capital budget by the governor. So we've been working with the capital budget, which of course hasn't been passed. But in there, one of the things they're looking at is an electric ferry, because we continue to have to replace ferries, on a continuing basis, and that some of our ferries are the biggest emitters of anything. There's those great big ones, especially. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic, and we also have a lot of support for. I think one of the things they want to do is keep the tax break for buying electric vehicles. It expires sometime in the next year, so we're going to have to revisit that. And I don't know quite where that money comes from, but it comes out of the general fund because it's sales tax. So we have to buy it down from the gas tax. Well, the gas tax is also flat. It's not decreasing, but it's flat, because as we do all these electric vehicles, we are now not using fuel. So we have a road user charge pilot that's being, if anybody wants to sign up and be in the pilot project, you can go online and look. And they're going to try and get it across the state to replace the gas tax. So if you do it, you take the gas tax to pay, but then everybody's paying a fair amount instead of having, an electric car not paying anything and a truck paying, a whole bunch.
Judy, can I ask a question about that? My understanding is you sign up and the pilot begins in January, and I think it runs for much of the year. You have, choices in terms of GPS privacy, et cetera, et cetera. But the other, just when there was an individual from Washington laying it out, it sounded like there was no real decision coming before the legislature for several years.
For several years.
Yeah.
Okay, so
No, you can't just go out and make that big of a change. All across the United States, they're having pilot projects, and Oregon, California, and Washington, actually, what made me think it was the green wall here that's on the side, or the blue wall, whatever you want to call it. We can actually pilot across our borders, and we're also going to pilot with 50 people in Canada. So that, and we're not actually exchanging money, but you're going through what it would look like. And so in a sense, you would be paying, people who drive a lot will pay more, but right now it's a mishmash depending on what type of car you have, and some people aren't paying much that drive a lot. So those are kinds of things. I will tell you that when you talk about the carbon tax, it's 12 cents, the one that's being talked about the most. It's 12 cents on the gas tax, which is a failing revenue stream, which, it's kind of like that might be pushing towards a road user charge more quickly. And so everybody's spending that money. We're going to do it on the property tax. Oh, we're going to pay the gas tax down. Oh, we're going to, whatever you're going to do. And since gas tax is the part of the emissions, it will probably put a damper on and make push people even quicker. We're really very high on electric vehicles here. But those are the dynamics of when you push one thing over here, something else happens over there, and you have to be careful as you do a pilot to figure out what all the things that might happen if you did it.
I wonder, Judy, because our community has expressed some interest in obviously last mile solutions, and we're starting,
Yes.
The council will have a conversation on Tuesday about this. So one of them being driverless, autonomous, You know, obviously,
Don't get too hung up on that unless you're gonna do that in about 10 years.
well, that's what I was wondering, like,
I'm
there's,
just not, I
It's
think
not-
there's a lot of people who think it's coming, but
but
it's not gonna
obviously
come
we
that
need,
quick.
yeah,
I'd
we
look
need
to live
the state to be behind it. We need, you know, it is one of those remedies that I think is in the future, but how far or how soon, we don't know. I think too, we're seeing an increase in electric bikes, right? And in fact, we just did an MRSC research, and I wanted to know, well, what cities have adopted legislation? And there are only 2 cities that have prohibited e-bikes. Oh yeah, no e-bikes, no electric bikes.
They're all over Europe.
Right. Kirkland and I think Lake Stevens, 2 cities that have prohibited, because, you know, I think part of it is because, what if you have mopeds or what, you know, it's kind of.
It's the speed.
It's the speed
And the blend on the bike corridors.
Yeah, we would probably want it not on Aubrey Davis.
Well, this
Well,
is
those are
part of the question.
questions. I think that's
Prompted
just-
some of the research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the extent to
Interesting.
which, because it seems that there's a blend in terms of legislative authority, in terms of allowing these e-bikes. I guess there's 3 categories or 3 classification levels that Washington State has pursued. It's common to a number of states. But, you know, one of the questions that I would have is the extent to which Mercer Island would have the ability to legislate which bikes or
And we
which
can.
speeds, et cetera, et cetera.
We can.
Even on the
state
I-90
has given us
corridor.
that authority.
But
Oh,
even
the
on
I-90? I
90
don't know about that.
Yeah.
I mean,
that
on
was
the,
what I
or
was
on
thinking, I
Aubrey
don't know.
Davis per se, because, you know, part of the question in this whole master plan is who owns what parts of it? So it's a long-term question,
True.
Yeah,
but it's an
yeah.
interesting one.
True, yeah. So anyway, I think those are some things that from a we're very interested in technology solutions that solve some of our transportation challenges. And just wondered if the legislature was examining those, studying those, looking at that, being forward-looking and.
And we are, and there's a funny dynamic in that the governor is so interested in them.
So, yeah.
That he wants to do them all, like the
Yeah.
autonomous vehicles, no, he wants to do them in little task forces, which he doesn't always allow us to be as involved as we would be. And so we have people in the legislature who want to work on autonomous vehicles and want to work on all these things. And the governor has his little group set up, so we're trying to put those walls down so that it will be,
So it's really under the governor. more
well,
than-
that's where he likes the high-speed rail.
Okay.
You know, he's got all those forward-thinking, futuristic, and at some point, he'll have to bring them in. What I said to
I
them,
would think.
don't surprise us. Don't come in with a ta-da, because then we'll pick it apart, and, you know, it'll take longer. Let us come in and work on it.
I think there's also been the irony that
Yeah.
because the governor loves these things, sometimes they've been harder to pass through the legislature because partisan politics get in not wanting him to have a win. So I think there've been, you know, a number of things at play there, but I think it's at least moving, and even if in little pockets. I do want to also just point out one other win last session was we extended the solar panel sales tax exemption. And so that was a key component too that I know our community cared about a lot. And Mercer Island has been great at promoting and supporting solar energy.
And that has increased definitely over the years. Okay.
Anything more on this? So topic 7, address the housing and homelessness crisis. We've of course talked a bit about this already. Feel anyone want to add more questions or comments? Okay. That's 7. 8 was provide cost recovery for long-range planning and code enforcement. Julie, this came out of staff, right? Staff recommendations.
I really think it kind of falls under this whole flexibility of getting more revenues to fund our operations.
Kirsten, did you have
Oh, I think that we were able to fund code enforcement for the increase in code enforcement through the permit fees because they are going to be directly enforcing the codes around, you know, permitting.